When Oxfam first began releasing research specifically on the phenomenon of increasing economic inequality, we named that political capture. It's a phenomenon that you are well aware of, and political capture is the term that we use to describe it. In far too many cases, the wealthy are able to capture politics and bend policies and decisions to their own will. And what's the result of this? Well, the way that we describe it is that the biggest winners from economic growth get the stranglehold on political power and democratic representation, and they reduce taxes on themselves and pass more wealth down onto their children and give those children the best education and the best healthcare and all the good jobs. And then they make sure that their kids enter parliament and run the country, and then the poorest will be trapped with little chance of escape. There will be few people with access to power who will be willing to support them or even to listen to them. And in practice, we see many examples of this right across the globe. I've been asked to talk today about Oxfam's approach to rising inequality and what we see as some of the public policy failures and opportunities within this challenge. This audience may be familiar with, as you highlighted, Claire, our research that we released 3 years ago. We had data showing that just 85 individuals owned the same wealth as the poorest half of the global population, and today that figure's dropped to just 62 individuals. It's hard to contemplate that 62 people hold the same amount of wealth as the bottom poorest 3.5 billion people. You may also know that wealthy individuals hide an estimated $18.5 trillion in tax havens worldwide, and that poorer nations lose at least $100 billion annually through tax avoidance and tax dodging practices of multinational companies. The situation has been allowed to happen because of policy failure on a global scale, and Oxfam believes that we can help to turn these around. Thank you. Before I get to telling you about some of the public policy responses that we propose to fight this growing inequality, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the consequences when public policy really does fail. As an organisation that works in more than 90 countries around the world, and we respond to disasters and emergency when it hits the poorest communities, Oxfam sees the effect of poor public policy firsthand. So, for example, in Sierra Leone, this was one of the nations where the Ebola epidemic recently spread. And here the tax incentives for just 6 firms were equivalent to 59% of the country's entire budget in 2012, and more than 8 times its spending on health and 7 times its spending on education. According to the World Health Organization, underinvestment in strong, accessible public health for the entire, mostly poor population is one of the reasons Ebola was able to get so out of control. Long-term economic decisions and economic rules that have allowed powerful corporations to avoid tax were absolutely part of the problem. Really tackling inequality means resisting and dismantling a lot of this power. It's hard because it's multifaceted. It's often deeply entrenched, and those who have it don't want to relinquish it. Thank you. So rising inequality and a failure of public policy to meet this challenge is of course not limited in Sierra Leone. So in our region, closer to home in Asia, 500 million people remain trapped in extreme poverty despite rapid economic growth. Much of the growth across Asia has been captured by those at the top. The region's richest man, Hong Kong's Li Ka-shing, has amassed $31 billion in wealth. That's an amount that would take the 500 million living in extreme poverty across Asia almost 68 million years to earn. That's even assuming that they could save all of their daily earnings. Women, rural dwellers, members of ethnic minorities, the elderly and the disabled are particularly vulnerable and likely to have missed out on Asia's economic boom. Across the region, wages have been kept low by governments valuing investment over people, meaning that in some nations across Asia, the legal minimum age is around 4 times lower than Oxfam would estimate is a fair and decent living wage for workers. So Bangladesh, for example, is the second largest supplier of clothing into the Australian market after China, and a garment worker there earns only around $20 Australian dollars a week. The good news is that the message that this is not good enough is starting to be heard on a global scale. Last year, the United Nations delivered a new global agreement, which you're probably aware about, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Australia has signed up to achieving these 17 goals by 2030. Goal 10 of the SDGs is aimed directly at tackling growing inequality. It focuses on increasing the incomes of the poorest 40% in each nation. And while it's a goal that could be stronger, we and others pushed very hard to ensure that the goal was included in the first place. The UN isn't the only forum where inequality has been entered or has entered into the public policy debate on a global scale. We've seen leaders including Barack Obama, Pope Francis, and now the contenders in the new American presidential race attempt to grapple with the issue of growing economic inequality. Other global organisations such as the IMF, the World Bank, and in our region, the Asian Development Bank, have been putting in place goals and policies to tackle this problem. So Oxfam sees this as a growing consensus for greater equality, a consensus that recognises that public policy needs to change to ensure that people are not left behind. And it's a growing consensus that recognises the old trickle-down model of economic growth simply doesn't work. So what really needs to happen to make the public policy ambition Goal 10 of the SDGs, greater equality, a reality? Well, the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, has released a report on these goals. It ranks how hard it might be to achieve each one. The report, which is called Projecting Progress, can be seen as a rallying call on policies to tackle inequality. It suggests that we need a complete reversal of current policies and trends if we're to get there by 2030. From Oxfam's perspective, there are a couple of areas where we see a need for reversal and change, both from an Australian perspective and also globally. So we've talked a little bit about it tonight on tax. We need real commitments to change tax systems and to make them fairer, both globally and at the national level. Vested interests need to be set aside, and the poorest and the most marginalised people do need to be the focus. What we've seen in Australia with the release of new data from the Australian Taxation Office, it's been revealed that tax minimisation is widespread amongst Australian companies, or aggressive tax minimisation. There's been a strong public reaction to this news and to the release of the Panama Papers that showed widespread global tax dodging is costing countries revenues across the world. All this means that in Australia, there's never been a better time for the government and political policies to really act on unfair tax practices. So I've mentioned that developing countries are stripped of at least $100 billion annually due to the tax avoidance and evasion practices of multinational companies. And this is simply not good enough. We've seen some good moves by BHP Billiton, who last year published the taxes they pay and profits that they make on a country-by-country basis. And more companies must follow suit. The Australian government too needs to be bolder on this issue and should follow the lead of the US, the EU and others by requiring companies to publish the same information that BHP has just volunteered on a country-by-country basis. And so far, neither of the two major political parties has committed to this country-by-country reporting. And yet, it's an opportunity to tackle inequality here in Australia and abroad. If we know that companies are avoiding and minimising taxes in Australia, the question that Oxfam wants answered is what exactly are Australian companies doing when they operate in our poor neighbouring nations, such as in PNG? And this is something that all political parties do need to grapple with. Secondly, I wanted to talk about international development, or aid. There's a role for Australian aid in helping to reduce inequality in our region. We are one of the wealthiest nations globally, and we consistently rank near the very top of the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report. So we can't walk away from what is our fair share on aid funding and an investment that could go towards the drivers of inclusive growth and poverty reduction. So instead, at the federal budget next week, Australia is already set to become the least generous we have ever been as a nation, with our aid dropping to its lowest ever level as a proportion of our national income. We're calling for all parties in Australia to commit to restoring the aid budget to at least $5.5 billion by the end of next parliamentary term. And this is the same amount of Australian aid had reached in 2013 when Labor had left office. Am I going for time? I might just, I know it's been a long night, I might just say one more thing about the private sector, if you'll indulge me. So Oxfam doesn't just see inequality as a public policy challenge for governments to grapple with, but we also believe that the private sector needs to change. We think that the private sector needs to really mean business, not only on paying their fair share of tax, but also on respecting human rights across the supply chains, on paying living wages and being transparent about their activities. For the large multinational private sector, this is the first and one of the most impactful ways that they can help to reduce inequality and poverty and to contribute to the SDGs. So it means leaving communities better, not worse off, due to operations such as large-scale resource extractions from developing countries. Oxfam, together with the University of Queensland Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, recently detailed a case in Mozambique where an Australian mining company fell far short of this credo, plunging a poorly resettled community into greater marginalisation and food insecurity. It also means that Australian banks and financial institutions need to ensure their lending doesn't support land grabbing from poor and marginalised communities, as was outlined in our report, Banking on Shaky Ground. And it means that clothing retailers need to ensure their predominantly female workforce in their source factories are able to work in safe conditions and to earn enough to support themselves and their families. Oxfam is working for a world free of poverty and inequality. I know this is a vision shared by all of you. I call you to join us. Thank you.